Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, September 20th, 2023. You might be familiar with the fact that the Federal Reserve is the engine that drives or powers the largest government in history. But you probably won't be surprised to hear me say that the Fed isn't going to end itself, and Congress is never, ever going to shut down its own printing press. So if we're ever going to really build a real land of the free rather than the largest government in history, we absolutely need to nullify the Federal Reserve into oblivion, where it has belonged since day one. But I first want to point out that we can trace the origins of the modern central bank to Alexander Hamilton's first national bank in 1791. Thanks again, Alexander Hamilton. His arguments and support have provided legal cover to much of the monster state we live under today. It certainly was a precursor to the Federal Reserve. And I'm not going to really get into the constitutional arguments today about the Federal Reserve because I've done that in many other episodes. So instead, I want to point you, if you're interested in learning more on that, I'm going to first point you to an episode that I did in November of 2022, The Central Bank versus the Constitution. And much of what I cited in that came from Mike Meharry's great handbook. It's 60 some odd pages, The National Bank versus the Constitution. I will link to both of those in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty so you can read and learn more. Now, what's most important is that we have to take action on a state, local, and individual level, because waiting for the federal government to limit its own power to stop the printing press, to shut down the Federal Reserve, only is going to guarantee that things are going to get worse and worse and worse, because waiting for the government to get rid of the unconstitutional bank that it never should have authorized in the first place all the way back in 1913 is just a guarantee that government will keep growing. Here's how Lysander Spooner put it in his defense for fugitive slaves in 1850. To say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one, for the latter is binding only until it is repealed. There would therefore be no difference at all between a constitutional and an unconstitutional law in respect to their binding force, and that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving to the government unlimited power. And I don't think there's really a better example that I can think of, at least today, of what Spooner is describing here than the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Mike Meharry describes it this way. Monetary policy run through the Fed enables much of the U.S. government's excessive borrowing and spending. Massive national debt, constant spending. Of course, they use that money to basically encourage the states to focus on national priorities rather than, focusing on defending the Constitution, upholding the Constitution. If the federal government, Mike says, had to rely on tax receipts and borrowing that it could actually repay, because they can't, to fund all its unconstitutional wars, foreign aid, and domestic spending, it would be dead in the water, especially at the size and scope of where it is today. The ability, Mike writes, to raise revenue through taxation and free market borrowing would naturally limit the government, at least to some degree. But with the Fed backstopping it all by monetizing the debt, there are virtually no limits on its spending, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And again, as long as people wait for Congress, for the executive branch, for the federal courts, or the Federal Reserve to limit their own power, this path will never stop. Now, not only does the Federal Reserve power all the spending, it's the primary driver of the boom-bust cycle that is absolutely wrecking the economy, up and down and up and down. The inflation, of course, I did an episode recently talking about how the founding generation referred to what we call as inflation as depreciation. And that way you can understand that the value, the purchasing power is being depreciated. It isn't just a bunch of evil corporations trying to rip you off and raise prices to gouge everybody. There is no greater price gouger in history than the Federal Reserve System. So it is the primary driver of this nasty boom-bust cycle. And I've got another great article by Meharry, How the Fed Wrecks the Economy, in just one quick piece here. He said, money printing and interest rate manipulations Fuel booms and the inevitable attempt to return to normalcy precipitates bust. In simplest terms, easy money blows up bubbles. Bubbles pop and set off a crisis. Wash, rinse, repeat. Now, if you want to get more detail on that process, Meharry's article is a great starting point. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes. But we're talking about how to nullify the Fed, how to end the Fed from the bottom up, how to resist it. And for that, I want to point to Thomas Jefferson, who said in his draft of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated. Let's try it again. Thomas Jefferson says, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, and I'm looking at the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 today, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Now, it's not just a good idea to try after a century or a few years or some court cases or, trying to get some new bums in there. It is the rightful remedy anytime they assume powers which have not been delegated. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the constitutional discussion on that. We're going to take the assumption Federal Reserve is unconstitutional and shouldn't exist. But even if you think it's totally fine to exist under the Constitution, the same strategies can be used because, as James Madison told us in Federalist 46, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union is an extremely effective approach for individuals and states to use against either a warrantable or constitutional federal act or an unwarrantable but unpopular one. That's according to the father of the Constitution. Here's James Iredell, one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court, nominated for that position by George Washington. The only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So the only way to deal with an exercise of power that the government shouldn't be exercising, again, looking at the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, is the right of the people to prevent its exercise. Now, mind you, the people have been facilitating the exercise and the implementation of the Federal Reserve Act and keeping the Federal Reserve afloat, because as long as people continue to use that dirty government fiat, there's no reason for it to ever go away. So the Fed has to go, whether we can convince the government or the people at large that it's unconstitutional or not. And ultimately, if we don't do that, they're just going to keep expanding their power and make things much worse. For example, we'll probably get a central bank digital currency. And here from another article by Meharry, as the push to implement a CBDC intensifies, opponents are lobbying for policies to preserve the right to use cash, primarily in the form of the US dollar. This makes sense on the surface. If people have the option to use physical currency, they can simply avoid the CBDC and the inherent control it would provide government actors. But I think at best, if people focus on using the current fiat system, at best, it's just delaying the inevitable because, well, we'll get into that in a moment. Mike points out, in the clamor to minimize the impact of a CBDC, many have lost sight of the inherent problems with paper fiat money in the first place. So whether it's paper, fiat, or digital, fiat money is government money that they use to control you. Now, a CBDC can monitor you more like a surveillance tool, where they can't necessarily do that with US dollar, the paper version. But a vast majority of transactions are electronic, and they're monitoring that already anyways. It's just going to take it to another level. But the fact of the matter is, either version of this fiat government money is still powering the largest government in history. It is a tool they use to control you either directly or indirectly. And Mike puts it this way: relying on fiat paper money might alleviate some of the problems of a CBDC, at least temporarily, until they just say, well, okay, we're doing it anyway. But it doesn't strike the root of the problem. And if you don't strike the root, if you just hack at branches, those branches grow back, and sometimes they're even stronger. Mike points out that we need currency competition. That's what's essential. We need something outside the government system. He says that means finding sound money alternatives to federal government-produced and controlled fiat money. That's so essential. And next up, I've got a number of examples. 5 main things that need to be done to nullify the Fed in practice and effect. End it from the bottom up. 4 involve state actions, state-level actions, and then the most important is, well, we'll just point it out, human action. But first, I keep mentioning we're going to link stuff in the show notes. Alan Mosley's been doing an awesome job helping me set up the blog post for every episode, and we get those published generally anywhere from 1 to 3 hours after the live stream is done. So that'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty sometime this afternoon. And on each one of these episodes, I'm just going to pull one up here. One, Dangerous Myth, Courts are the Last Bulwark Against Tyranny. All of these are set up with basically the same template. Maybe we'll be able to improve it at some point with some help or ideas. But basically what you're going to see for every episode is a single blog post where you get an overview at the top. Then you have the audio podcast edition, some links to various podcast platforms, then a video edition, and then a show links section. So all the main stuff that I reference in each episode, we include in the show notes so you can read or find other episodes, learn more in context on your own time, because I'm always just scratching the surface. And then, of course, if you scroll further down, you can find all the other video platforms around, whether it's Rumble, Odyssey, Sovereign, Twitter, Minds, X, Facebook, BitChute, Brighteon, LinkedIn, Gab, as many places as possible. If we're missing from a platform that you'd love to see us on, please send us a message, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, or leave it in the comments on any of these platforms. Of course, all your feedback is very, very important to us, even if we don't get a chance to get back to a vast majority of them. Anyways, let's get back into the solutions part of this, because that's very important. We know Federal Reserve, bad. Federal Reserve, evil, shouldn't exist. Unconstitutional, constitutional, I don't care what you think. I think absolutely unconstitutional, and that's an easy one for me. But here are some steps that we can do to encourage people to use alternatives to the federal system. And these are all from the upcoming, I don't know the right term for this, the new State of the Nullification Movement report for 2023. You can find the current version over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Meharry and I are going through the final touches on this, and I'm actually looking for someone who's good at typesetting for books to take that off my hands this year. But we should have this done and available for you for free at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report in the next couple of months, definitely before Christmas season. But here's the first step. And because first of all, because it's part of the Constitution, we focus in our strategy primarily on sound money via gold and silver. But if you happen to prefer something else, these same types of legislative actions and the human action at the end can apply to really whatever you find is something that motivates you. I figure most people following us here at the 10th Amendment Center are very interested in Article 1, Section 10 and the fact that gold and silver is sound money. But anyways, the first step is recognize gold and silver as legal tender in a state-by-state level, or as money, basically. The government at all different levels have basically wanted us to treat money as an investment vehicle and fiat trash as money. So they want us to treat the U.S. dollar as money and gold and silver as just some place to park your loot, hopefully get a gain on it, and then they can tax you on it. But this is totally backwards. So some states are starting to flip things around a little bit. Here from our report in 2011, Utah became the first state in modern times to do what it is supposed to have been doing all along. That is, formally recognize gold and silver coins issued by the United States as legal tender. They expanded it over time beyond just coins, but we put in the report the impact of this success is multi-tiered. Many forms in gold and silver inside the Beehive State are now recognized to be what they were always supposed to be, legal tender, under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. They followed up by expanding this legislation a number of times. It's the Utah Legal Specie Legal Tender Act is what it's called, I believe. They expanded the Legal Tender Act to clarify several tax measures, and more importantly, they expanded the definition of specie to include gold and silver coins, gold and silver, approved by the state. It didn't have to just come from the federal government. So that's step number one. And as a result of this, we now have something called the Goldback over at goldback.com, which will, of course, be linked to in the show notes. It's the world's, this is how they describe it, the world's first physical interchangeable gold money. The stuff is actually a piece of art. It's pretty incredible. I wonder if I can get some quick pictures up here. Yeah, there you go. You can see it up on the screen. It's literally like it's made with gold. I don't understand the technology behind it, but of course you can read about it. It's in 1, 5, 10, 25, and 50 denominations. There is a markup on it. It's not cheap, but It's definitely something that's gaining some traction. And we're now seeing not just Utah have this happen, and not just the Goldback only in Utah. There's a number of states that have Goldbacks issued now. But a few other states have also recognized gold and silver as legal tender. Some organizations cite others that we don't feel really qualify, and maybe that would be an article on its own or another episode. But the ones we've seen is Utah, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and then this year, Arkansas now treat gold and silver as money rather than just a mere investment vehicle. And so that brings me to number 2. That is, eliminate sales taxes and capital gains taxes on the exchange of money. Because when government treats gold and silver as an investment tool or an investment vehicle rather than as money, then there's all kinds of different ways they can get their grubby little tax hands all over it. And here's an example that Meharry put together for our report. Imagine if you asked a grocery clerk to break a $5 bill and you were charged a 35-cent tax. Silly, right? After all, you were only exchanging one form of money for another. But that's essentially what a sales tax on gold and silver does. They don't treat it as money. So if you take a piece of gold, whether it's a Goldback or a coin or a bar, and you swap it out for US dollars, it doesn't matter where, they consider that a sale. And so therefore, you can be dinged with a sales tax. You could also be dinged with a capital gains tax because it is an investment tool. So they could charge you whatever the fees are. I don't even know. It's insane. But Mike says sales and capital gains taxes treat gold and silver as property instead of money. They also raise transaction costs. And I think this is the most important point because it creates a barrier to use gold and silver in everyday transactions. So if every time you have to make a purchase, people are not necessarily, in some situations, people are definitely not dumb. And when it comes to the option of spending $100 on something, or maybe you get a 10% tax, $110, especially in a time where we have so much depreciation and the cost of goods and living costs so much more, people are being a little bit smarter about how they spend. And if you have an option to save a little bit of money or spend a little bit more, maybe that means it is also discouraging the use of gold and silver as money. I think that's intentional, but we're not going to get too tinfoil hatty today. They also raise transaction costs, Mike Meharry writes, creating a barrier to using gold and silver in everyday transactions. Repealing taxes is a crucial first step towards the use of specie as money. Now, in 2023, we note in the report, Mississippi became the 43rd state to eliminate sales taxes on gold and silver bullion. It's a small step, but it does remove a small barrier to using gold and silver as money in everyday transactions. And maybe it has to be the first step. Maybe it has to be later. It doesn't matter. It does have to get done. So we've got 43 states. Ron Paul came out in support of a piece of legislation similar to this. I believe it was just dealing with capital gains taxes in Arizona a few years ago. And he put it this way: we ought not to tax money. And of course, he gave us a nice quote here: paper is not money, it's fraud. So that's number 2, eliminate the taxes, sales and capital gains on the exchange of one form of money to another. In other words, treat gold and silver as what they always should have been treated, money. Number 3 is authorize state and gold and silver reserves. This is kind of a new approach. In recent years, we've been seeing some efforts to do this, and in 2023, the state of Tennessee enacted a law creating a process. It's not a guarantee, but they created a process for the state to buy, sell, and hold gold and silver in their state reserves. In practice, Meharry writes, the enactment of the law allows the state of Tennessee to hold reserves of gold, silver, platinum, and palladium coins and bars. And it can act as a hedge against rapidly depreciating Federal Reserve notes. The more sound money, the more precious metals that a state holds, the stronger they can be against the threats of coercive funding pressure from the federal government as well. I think that's more of a long game vision, but it's also very important. Holding gold and silver in reserve, Meharry writes, also creates a pathway for states to maintain financial independence should the U.S. dollar collapse, a very real possibility as the world moves away from the greenback as its reserve currency. Number 4 is establish gold depositories. It's listed here in the report as state, and I think maybe we'll change that before the final publication if I remember to do this, because it can be on a state, it could be created by the state, or it can be a free market one. I lean towards the free market one being better, but that's how we started out in this section. Whether they are private entities or state-run, bullion depositories can facilitate the use of sound money and undermine the Federal Reserve's monopoly on currency. People have to have a place to store it. And if you store it, you have to have a place to be able to use it in transactions. And I'll get to that in a moment. The Texas Bullion Depository officially opened for business in 2018. It provides a secure place for individuals, businesses, cities, counties, government agencies, and even other countries to store gold and other precious metals. You don't have to be a resident of Texas. Anybody can open an account and store their money in the Bullion Depository in Texas. There are plans, and I don't think they've actually come to fruition yet, but to create a functionality where you could get a debit card and actually it does an automatic, seamless behind-the-scenes transaction behind the scenes, and you can just go and pay whatever online service or in the store, and you're actually using your gold and silver as money. And then the idea is spend and replace. Every time you spend something, buy more and replenish it, and then you're actually holding your purchasing power. Now, that's not the only one. We also have in Utah, the United Precious Metals Association, UPMA. I don't have the website up here, but it's based in Utah. It's similar to the Texas Bullion Depository. It is a depository, but it's privately owned. Again, United Precious Metals Association, they offer a linked debit card for this. They already have this, so you can use sound money as money instead of just a mere investment vehicle. It's really so important. Now, here's how Meharry described it. UPMA and the Texas Bullion Depository offer a strategy for other states to follow. If the majority of states controlled their own supply of gold, it would conceivably make the Federal Reserve completely irrelevant, provided the people want to use it. Now, ultimately, it gets down to the people's choice. It could set the foundation for the people to nullify the Federal Reserve's monopoly on money in practice and effect. And I think that what Mike had to say there is the most important part here. It's ultimately up to the people to nullify the Fed, because it doesn't matter how many laws. If all the states passed all these laws, all 4 of them, they repealed all the taxes, they made gold and silver as legal tender, they established a depository. What's the one I'm missing? Oh, and they had the reserves. If they did all this stuff, if the people still choose to use the fiat government trash, the US dollar, then nothing gets nullified. So ultimately, it gets down to human action. And that is step number 5. We have a whole section on this, human action, but this is the most important quote from it. People's willingness to use government fiat is what got us into this position to begin with. Instead, it will take people and businesses willing to use and accept forms of money that are not created and controlled by the government. And that's really what it gets down to. As I've cited so many times on different episodes on this show, in different articles at the 10th Amendment Center, it's ultimately up to the people. John Dickinson said, how do you deal with a bad administration? He said, well, the answer is to be found before the supreme sovereignty of the people. It is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, to provide that the Republic receive no damage. Now, we've gotten a lot of damage in the Republic. The Constitution hasn't been preserved, but it is up to the supreme sovereignty of the people, and ultimately, only when the people love liberty and choose real money over this fake garbage that they throw in our face, this control grid that they want to build all around us constantly, that's when things will change. And there's nothing, if you want to help us get this kind of message out to more people, there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work day in and day out more than the financial faith and support of our members. I've got it up on the screen here. Talking about that dirty government fiat, you can throw a couple of bucks our way. Our membership program starts out at $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options there. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I do want to take a quick moment and say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members recently. There's Robert in Maryland, Joshua in New Jersey, Julie in Florida, William in Missouri, and Crystal. Hopefully I get that right. I ask my Missouri friends all the time. We've got family there. I've got friends. And it depends on the part of the state. Some people tell me it's Missouri. Some people tell me it's Missouri. And I know there's a little conflict there. And I'm an outsider. I'm an interloper from this country over here anyways. But William, I appreciate you. And Crystal in Tennessee and everyone else that I didn't mention. And those of you who are not brand new members, I know every time I look in the chat, and I'm not going to get to the comments and questions here on the live stream, but I look through it later in the day, and I always see a handful of people who are members, if not more, and I'm so grateful for you putting your financial faith behind our work. Again, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you're having a great day, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.